He who is too sensitive to others is most often deaf to himself. Have you ever wondered why some people feel so much while others seem to move through the world as if nothing ever touches them? Is empathy really a virtue or a curse disguised as nobility? And what if I told you that your sensitivity is not a spiritual gift, but a psychological scar that learned to smile? The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, said Carl Jung. But what happens when, from the very beginning, everything you are was shaped to keep others comfortable? When your existence is reduced to the silent mission of feeling for others what no one wanted to feel for themselves. If you are here, perhaps you have already noticed something strange about your way of existing. Maybe you feel exhausted without knowing why. Maybe you have spent your life apologizing for having needs. Maybe you feel a rage you cannot name, a rage that burns inside not because you hate others, but because you have been forgetting yourself for years. This video is not a hymn to the empath. It is a dissection, a ritual of lucidity, a brutal yet necessary invitation to look in the mirror and face the question most people avoid. What if my goodness were only a well-trained defense mechanism? Today, guided by the abyssal psychology of Carl Jung, we will enter the wound that gave birth to your way of feeling. We will take apart what lies behind your compassion and why it may be silently killing you. You were not born an empath. You were born human. But at some point, and perhaps you do not even remember when, your survival instinct was forced to transform into sensitivity, not because it was beautiful, but because it was necessary. Carl Jung never romanticized empathy the way social media does today. He knew that many times a good heart is a muffled scream. It is a child who learned too early that having emotions was dangerous, that asking was a risk, that taking up space was punished. So that child learned the subtle art of disappearing, feeling for others all that no one wanted to feel for them. For Jung, empathy often arises as a neurotic response, not as a choice, but as a mechanism, a shield disguised as an embrace, a prison disguised as love. Think of that child who watched their father before asking anything. That girl who measured every word against her mother's reaction, who sensed the atmosphere, who anticipated the emotional weather of the house. She did not do it because she was emotionally evolved. She did it because deep down she knew, if I get the tone wrong, I could be rejected. And thus emotional hypervigilance is born, the embryo of what in adulthood we call empathy. But Jung gave it another name, premature adaptation of the ego. It is when the child's psyche, pressured by an emotionally unstable environment, leaps ahead in its psychological development. It learns codes it should not know. It becomes too mature. It turns into the mother's counselor, the father's shield, the sibling's therapist, and it disappears. Have you ever felt that no matter how much you help, how present you are, how much you give, no one takes care of you in the same way? That is the hidden root of neurotic empathy, the habit of giving yourself away as a means of survival, not as an act of generosity. You learned that you were loved only when you did something for others, that love arrived with an emotional invoice, that caring for the other was the safest way to avoid abandonment. You became an antenna. You picked up pain, subtleties, silences. But what about you? Who picked you up? Jung said the true tragedy is not having a shadow, but not knowing it exists. In the empath's case, that shadow is made of rage, ego, need. Everything you learn to repress to be accepted, everything you call selfishness, but is really your right to exist. How many times did you swallow your tears so as not to make others uncomfortable? How many times did you bend to someone's mood just to keep the peace? How many times did you say it is fine while inside you were begging for a hug? Compulsive empathy is not a virtue, it is refined trauma. It is a soul that learned to survive by staying quiet, by loving too much, by yielding always. And that kind of empathy charges a high price. It charges you health, energy, identity. It turns you into a useful ghost, always present yet invisible. And here is the cruelest paradox. The empath suffers from feeling too much. yet is terrified of feeling less. Because if they stop feeling they fear love will vanish, the connection will break, that without their sacrifice they will become disposable. But Jung warns us, the soul needs truth more than peace. And the truth is that you do need to learn to be selfish, not vulgar, destructive, narcissistic selfishness, but what Jung called healthy narcissism. The capacity to recognize yourself as legitimate, to say no, to prioritize yourself, to place yourself at the center of your life without fearing being hated. The empath gets sick by not understanding that being good does not mean erasing oneself, that true love demands boundaries, that compassion is not carrying others on your shoulders. It is extending a hand with your feet firmly on the ground. You do not need to save anyone. You need to stop abandoning yourself. How many times have you been proud of being the person everyone seeks when they are unwell? Now ask yourself, whom do you seek when you are the one in need? Do you see it? There is a mismatch between all you give and the little you allow yourself to receive. Because deep down, you still believe love depends on your usefulness. You still hear that inner voice saying, if I do not help, they will leave me. Jung called that conditioned identity, a version of you created to satisfy others' expectations. A golden cage where applause is constant, but freedom does not exist. You are not only empathic, you are trapped in a cycle of emotional self-denial. And the worst part is that the world applauds. How generous you are, how sensitive. You have such a big heart, but no one sees the fatigue. No one sees how much you swallow, how much you silence your rage, your urge to disappear, your frustration with ingratitude, and all of that accumulates in the shadow. Jung said, you do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. It is time to light up that darkness, to recognize that your empathy is indeed beautiful, but not when it is born of guilt, not when it is born of fear, not when it is compulsive. You can be good, but only if you are also good to yourself. You can care, but not at the cost of your mental health. You can love, but only if you include yourself in that love. The hidden root of empathy is not generosity, it is survival. It is the child who could never be selfish, who could never scream, throw a tantrum, make demands, and who therefore became someone who feels for everyone except themselves. But now something inside you is changing. You are beginning to hear yourself. You are growing tired of pleasing. You are, for the first time, considering putting yourself first. And that is a revolution, because as Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And you, dear empath, were not born to be the emotional support of a dysfunctional world. You were born to be whole, with light and shadow, with love and rage, with empathy and ego. Being good is not dying for others. Being good is living for yourself and then overflowing. There is something you need to know now. Has it ever happened that just when you most needed to remain calm, your mind collapsed? That loss of control is not only emotional, it is mental. It happens because most of us were trained to feel before thinking, to react before observing. The problem is structural. No one taught us to train the mind like a muscle, so every small frustration becomes an explosion and every challenge an inner defeat. But there is a different way to operate, a framework based on neuroscience, applied philosophy, and silent mental techniques that reprogram your responses and place you back in command. We recorded a video showing how it works step by step. If you want to watch it now, scan the code on screen or click the link in the description or in the first pinned comment. There are children who, even before they learn to read, already master the invisible vocabulary of others' emotions. No one needs to say, I am sad. They feel it, catch it, sense it. They develop a kind of silent radar that anticipates the scream before the sound, the blow before the gesture, the disappointment before the word. Those children are not magical, they are survivors. Carl Jung called the psychic antennas a kind of emotional hypersensitivity that arises when the family environment is not safe enough for the child simply to be. They learn that the world around them is unpredictable and that to survive, they must develop eyes where no one sees, ears where no one speaks, intuitions where there is no logic. They become emotional sentinels, not by choice, but because their integrity depends on it. Do you remember how it was? Watching every step your parents took, deciphering their mood from a small change in tone of voice, walking carefully as if the floor were made of invisible glass, realizing that sometimes silence was more dangerous than the scream. The antenna child grows up believing that their own feelings are dangerous. If they cry, they are called weak. If they laugh loudly, they are excessive. If they ask for attention, they are selfish. So they learn not to express themselves and later not to feel. But there is a cruel detail. When you silence your pain, your body keeps screaming, only on the inside. That child becomes the adult who picks up everything. The energy in the room, the unspoken pain of others, the tension compressed into a glance. They become the friend who senses something is wrong, the partner who notices the mood shift, the employee who knows when the boss will explode. They become useful, even admired, but not for who they are, only for how much they can adjust to others. Jung saw this as a profound imbalance, a form of socially accepted neurosis, because it presents as generosity, empathy, altruism. Yet at its core, it is a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. You feel everything from everyone all the time, except yourself. And do you know why? Because looking inward hurts more than absorbing the world's pain. Your own pain is too old, too dense, ignored for too long, and it frightens you. Jung called this inner disconnection a split of the soul. It is when you become so specialized in feeling others that you become a stranger to yourself. How many times have you found yourself in relationships where you are always the one who understands, who forgives, who sees their side? How many times did you justify emotional aggression by saying they had a hard childhood, or they do not know how to handle their emotions? You are not compassionate. Were you conditioned? You do not forgive from the heart. You forgive from guilt. You do not understand with empathy. You understand with fear. Fear of being rejected if you demand respect. Fear of being abandoned if you set boundaries. Fear of being called selfish if you dare to choose yourself. And here is the psychic cost of feeling too much. You stop being a self and become an extension of the other. You know what the other wants, feels, needs. But when someone asks, "What do you want?" silence swallows you because you do not know. You became an expert interpreter and illiterate about yourself. Jung said the soul cannot endure a lie for long. It begins to shout through anxiety, chronic exhaustion, repetitive relationships, the feeling that something is wrong with me and I do not know what it is. That shout is often muffled with more empathy. You help more, listen more, carry more. But the truth is that you need a hug and no one ever gave it to you. You need to be seen, not as the one who understands everyone, but as someone who also needs to be understood. And that terrifies the child who was praised for being mature. Because breaking that role means breaking the identity you built your whole life. But what if Jung is right? What if that identity is an illusion? What if you are not truly that exceedingly empathic, ever available, ever understanding person, but someone who learned to be that way to survive in a world where being authentic was dangerous? You feel too much not because you are enlightened, but because you are too exposed, too vulnerable, subtly abandoned. Your extreme sensitivity is, in fact, the trace of abandonment. It is the symptom of a childhood where you had to monitor the weather to avoid being swallowed by the storm. Jung knew what that produces: repressed rage, fractured self-esteem, hunger for recognition, unconscious attraction to emotionally unavailable people. You do not want to be loved. You desperately want to be finally enough. But to do that, you will have to disappoint some people. The ones accustomed to your docility, the ones who feed on your guilt, the ones who call your first step toward freedom change. You will have to leave the antenna role, and that is frightening. Because deep down you feel that if you are not useful, you will be discarded. But Jung left us another truth. You will never be whole while you are only a reflection of the other. It is time to turn inward, to rescue the child who one day learned that feeling for others was safer than being herself. She is still there, frightened but alive, and wants to be received not as a spiritual tool, not as an emotional warrior, but as what she always was, a human being who deserved to exist without having to fix anyone. That is your task now. Sit with that child. Be with her in the silence. Tell her, I no longer need to guess what others feel. I want to know what I feel. And when that inner voice begins to surface, fragile, hesitant, confused, listen to it. Listen with the same care you have always given others. Listen as one holds a broken mirror with steady fingers and an open heart. Because you are not an antenna, you are a complete being with history, with pain, with a voice, and finally with permission to use it. Every empath has a limit, and almost no one notices when it has been crossed. Because the empath does not shout, does not fight, they swallow it. But inside there is a fire. Carl Jung warned us, everything that we do not face within ourselves, we will meet as destiny. Perhaps that is the empath's destiny, to end up surrounded by people they themselves taught not to respect them. Not out of malice, but out of habit, out of a silent history of self-abandonment disguised as kindness. The empath, that seemingly sweet, understanding, enlightened being, carries a dense, pulsing shadow hidden beneath the cloak of goodness. And that shadow, dear one, is called rage. It is not a loud rage. It is a ashamed rage. A rage that was never allowed to exist. A rage that learned to keep quiet, to turn into it is all fine, into it was nothing, into let it go. But that does not forget what has been denied. It stores it, it collects it. Jung said the unconscious is timeless. What has not been lived keeps beating within us, asking to pass, asking to exist. In the empath's case, what was not lived was the right to protect oneself, to say no, to stay, to leave, to have desires. Do you realize that your rage is always directed at yourself? You help too much and feel used but say nothing. You yield always and feel small, yet smile. You are the last to be heard, and you still give thanks for a listening that never came. Until when? Until when will you carry others' weight believing that makes you better? That is not goodness, it is prison. Jung called this the formation of the shadow by moral conditioning. It is when everything you feel that does not fit the ideal imposed on you is thrown to the bottom of the soul. Rage, frustration, ego, desire, exhaustion, all that was labeled ugly, wrong, selfish. And what happens to what you repress? It turns into symptoms. It becomes a pain in the chest. It becomes insomnia, an exhausted body, chronic resentment. And sooner or later, it becomes an explosion. The person who always said yes one day shouts. The person who always understood one day cuts ties. The one who carried the world one day drops everything, and no one understands why. How could you change? You were always so available. What a disappointment. Disappointment for whom? For those accustomed to your silence. For those who projected on you the role of savior, therapist, mother, father. Jung calls this projective identification. People are not relating to you. They are relating to the role you took on. And when you start dismantling that role, they feel betrayed. But the truth is that you betrayed yourself earlier when you accepted a role you never wanted to play. Here is the crucial point. The rage beating within you is legitimate. It is yours. It is sacred. It is life's energy telling you, enough. Enough swallowing everything. Enough staying silent. Enough justifying yourself for having human needs. You have the right to say no, to fail, to refuse to help, to choose your own well-being without explanations. The empath's rage is not destructive. It is the vital signal of a soul tired of faking docility. But listen, before it can free you, you must look at it with new eyes, without fear, without shame. Jung said one does not become enlightened by imagining light, but by making darkness conscious. For the empath, that darkness is the repressed scream, the boundary never set, the life left in the background so others could be comfortable. Do you think it is beautiful to give all of yourself? And you, what do you receive? Do you think it is noble to always forgive? And who forgives you? Unregulated empathy becomes a prison. You get lost in others' feelings and forget you also have a heart that bleeds. How many times did you want to shout, "Enough," and only said, "It is okay"? How many times did you think, "What about me?" and kept smiling? That emotional repetition creates an existential void. You become an empty container, useful, functional, adorable, but empty. And that is why rage appears. It wants to wake you up. It wants to remind you that you are still alive. Rage at its core is self-love that learned to wear armor. Do not run from it. Do not fear that fire. Learn to steer it. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to unite opposites. In your case, empathy and boundary, kindness and firmness, sweetness and protection. That union is what he called shadow integration. It is not about choosing between remaining good or turning cold. It is about allowing yourself to be whole. You do not need to be less sensitive, but you do need to be more integral. The person you want to be, the one who loves without erasing themselves, who helps without destroying themselves, appears only when you look at your shadow and say, "I see you, I welcome you, I release you." The empath's rage is the fury of one who was never seen, who was used as an emotional anchor without ever being able to anchor in anyone, who carried the world's traumas on the fragile shoulders of a child who only wanted a hug. And do you know the first step to healing? To say no without guilt, without justification, without fearing the loss of that love that existed only while you denied yourself? For the empath to bloom, expectations must be frustrated. Those who grew used to your submission must be disappointed. You must break the cycle that kept you captive, even the cycle you carry inside. Jung called this the courage to individuate, to become who you truly are, even if that means leaving behind who you pretended to be. And that courage begins with a simple, radical gesture: to choose yourself. Arif, music. There comes a moment when the empath, who feels everything for everyone all the time, finally perceives an uncomfortable truth. No one asked them to sacrifice themselves, and even so, they did. For peace, for acceptance, for love, for a safe place in the world. But what did they receive in return? Silence, exhaustion, invisibility. Carl Jung said the unlived life is a disease of the soul, and that may be the empath's silent illness. Living half alive to maintain the image of someone who always says yes, who loves, helps, endures, even when everything inside begs for rest. But a subtle moment arrives, sometimes imperceptible, when something breaks inside. An invisible thread that always kept the empath tied to the savior role snaps, and then the void arrives. Not the void of lack, but the void of discovery. The discovery that you spent years being good out of fear, that your generosity was compulsive, that your capacity to listen to everyone was a way to silence yourself. You called it love, but it was an escape. Escape from rejection, from loneliness, from your own emotional complexity, escape from truth. Jung said the path to healing begins with confrontation, and there is no confrontation harsher than this. Realizing that sacrifice was never a choice, it was programming, conditioning, survival. From early on, you learned that your feelings were not a priority. You were the strong one, the mature one, the different one. You could not err, complain, shout. They praised you for caring for others, but no one noticed that in doing so you were ceasing to live. You were molded to attend, not to be attended to listen, not to speak, to give, not to receive. And so a very specific prison is born, the prison of obligatory goodness. Here's the secret Jung left us, and many ignore. True altruism is born only from choice. When it comes from fear, it is only slavery by another name. So ask yourself now, honestly, starkly, without defenses. How many times did you say yes, wanting to say no? How many times did you love someone who hurt you just to keep the connection? How many times did you place another's pain above your own and later cried in hiding? This is where emotional authenticity is born, not as a pretty ideal or theoretical concept, but as a cry of the soul, as an urgency, the urgency to stop lying to yourself. You no longer need to erase yourself to keep the peace. You no longer need to sacrifice to be loved. You no longer need to hide your pain behind empathy. Emotional authenticity is born in the exact instant you decide to stop being a character. It is born in the discomfort of disappointing others, in the pain of losing bonds that existed only because you pretended to have no desires. It is born like every real birth, with pain, with blood, with rupture. And like every birth, it demands courage. The courage to look into the eyes of someone you love and say, I cannot keep abandoning myself to keep you close. That is not cruelty, it is psychic maturity. Jung called this the transcendence of the persona, the social mask we use to be accepted. For the empath, that mask bears names like good, understanding, strong, mature. But that mask suffocates. Jung warned, the more perfect the mask, the more suffocated the soul. So you must choose. Will you remain the functional, admired, exhausted empath? Or will you begin to build your true self, even if that brings side glances, accusations of selfishness, and the loss of some relationships? It is a choice, and for the first time, you may be ready to make it. Emotional authenticity is like opening a window in a room where the air had grown scarce. At first, the wind frightens you. You feel cold, vertigo. But little by little, you realize you can breathe. Breathe without having to please. Breathe without calculating the emotional impact of every word. Breathe without having to be everyone's emotional comfort. Jung said the authentic self is the one that integrates all the rejected parts. And for the empath, one of those rejected parts is precisely the right to exist without guilt. You have the right to exist without justifying yourself, to have no energy, to change your mind, to care for yourself before caring for others. That is not selfishness, it is emotional justice. There lies the key to transformation. Your empathy does not need to die. It only needs to stop being compulsive and become a choice. You can keep feeling, but now with discernment. You can keep helping, but now with boundaries. You can keep loving, but now with roots. Emotional authenticity does not erase sensitivity, it refines it. It transforms empathy from a silent curse into a conscious gift. It returns you to yourself. And in the end, perhaps that is what Jung most wanted to show us, that individuation is really a return, not to the person others expect, but to the one you always were before you learned to hide. Sacrifice or choice. You no longer have to die for anyone. Now you can be born for yourself. Music. There comes a point when you look at all you have built and realize that much of your life was molded not by desire, but by duty. Friends you kept so as not to hurt them. Relationships you sustained so as not to disappoint. Family you tolerated. In silence while inside you died a little at every gathering. You called that love, but Jung would call it neurotic adaptation. The version of yourself you manufactured to be loved, even if that meant disappearing. This chapter is about the return, not to the essential, the coach's cell, but to the center of gravity of your psyche, sovereignty. Carl Jung said, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. And awakening for the empath is realizing that their gift becomes power only when it is freed from the obligation to save the world. The empath was not born to be a martyr. They were born to be complete. But how do you achieve that when everything pushes you back into the caregiver role? When your identity was built on the idea that your value lies in being useful, sensitive, sacrificial, You begin with rupture. The rupture that at first looks like selfishness, but slowly reveals itself as courage. Courage to choose yourself. Courage to disappoint. Courage not to be available all the time. Courage to be clear even when that creates silence. Courage to have needs, to discomfort, to be real. Jung called this psychic differentiation. The moment you understand, I am not others, I am not what they expect of me. I am an autonomous universe. And that universe has its own laws, its limits, its desires, its yeses, its nos. From this point on, the empath's journey changes direction. You stop acting as the emotional thermometer of rooms and become an axis. Someone who feels yes, but chooses what to do with what they feel. Someone who loves and also loves themselves. This new empath is what Jung would call individuated, no longer moved by the unconscious need to repair, but by the conscious force of simply existing. You learn that not every pain is yours to carry, not every story deserves your listening, not every request demands a response. For someone who lived as a reflection, that is liberating yet painful, because it requires breaking invisible contracts with people who grew used to using you as an emotional crutch. You will disappoint. They will accuse you of changing. You will hear that you are distant, cold, strange. Remember, those words come from those who benefited from your lack of boundaries, from those who confused empathy with servitude. Here comes the most powerful turn. The relationships that survive your sovereignty are the only ones worthy of remaining. Jung called this relational recalibration. Dynamics reorganize, fragile bonds break, true bonds deepen. And you finally realize you were never hard to love. Your relationships were too shallow to hold your depth. That is the beauty of emotional sovereignty. You stop begging for spaces that crush you and begin to inhabit spaces that expand you. But be warned, sovereignty comes with a price. You will have no more excuses. You will no longer be able to say, I did it because I had to. You will have to own your choices, your absences, your presence, your silence. Many step back here because it is easier to keep saving others than to face the emptiness of not knowing who you are without that function. It is more comfortable to stay the easygoing one than to be the selfish one who prioritizes mental health. But you already know, any comfort that demands your absence is a kind of emotional suicide. Choose the discomfort of presence, the weight of truth, the nakedness of authenticity. You do not have to be the hero or the mirror or the eternal shoulder. You can simply be you, with flaws, desires, contradictions, intensity, and rest. Jung said, true freedom is born only when you accept your totality. The empath's totality is not only in their light, but also in their shadow, in their tiredness, in their rage, in their silence. Sovereignty is not a permanent state of balance. It is the capacity to hold yourself without needing others' applause to feel complete. You are not responsible for everyone, nor for the world's mood, nor for the wounds of those who refuse to heal. Your greatest responsibility now is to yourself. And paradoxically, when you choose yourself, you can finally choose others more truthfully, without guilt, without dependence, without strain. You help because you want to, not because you must. You listen because you have energy, not because you owe it. You love because you overflow, not because you beg for acceptance. That is sovereignty, and for the empath, that is rebirth. So breathe deeply. You are not betraying anyone. For the first time, you are being loyal to yourself, and that, dear one, is the true miracle of conscious empathy. At the end of it all, when the night silence is more honest than any word spoken during the day, one question rises that we can no longer sweep under the emotional rug. And me, when will someone take care of me? Perhaps you have spent your life as someone's shoulder, the emotional anchor of many. Perhaps you learned that to love is to tend, to serve, to offer, until you empty yourself completely, and everyone applauds you for it. They call it compassion, generosity, a gift. But Carl Jung offered a brutally honest perspective. Not all empathy is virtue. Sometimes it is only the scar of a childhood where you had to feel for everyone because no one was willing to feel for you. The empath is not born only with a big heart. The empath is born in environments where their own heart had to mold itself to others' pain in order not to disappear. Environments where they learn that to be loved requires effort, that to exist is to be useful, that others' silence must be filled with their constant listening. You became a mirror, a medicine, a crutch, and after so much reflecting, you forgot your own face. But now something has moved within you, perhaps imperceptibly, like the first tremor before the earthquake, perhaps like a mild discomfort, a different fatigue, a need not to be so available and, for the first time, not to feel guilty about it. That is the seed of your individuation. Jung said the process of becoming who one is does not arrive as illumination, but as crisis. You do not wake up one day feeling free. You collapse, you drop the character, you break the armor, and you allow the true self, the one you abandoned to fit in, to finally return. But that self returns with demands. It no longer wants to be useful. It wants to be free. It wants to love without begging, to give without emptying itself, to be present without having to save.